What's up, everybody? Today I'm going to be comparing the AMD Radeon 6900 XT to the NVIDIA RTX 3080 with both of these cards overclocked. Now, this card is a little bit more, coming in at just under $1,000, while the RTX 3080 technically starts at $700 with the AIB models costing a little bit more. So for today's video, I'm going to be using the Powercolor Reference RX 6900 XT and an XC3 RTX 3080. I think these cards are fairly comparable in that they're both mid-range offerings. It's certainly not a Strix card on either one. And the main difference that you're going to find there is that these have lower power limits than some of the other offerings. One note that I do want to make on the 3080 is that the XC3 Ultra does have a lower power limit than the Founders Edition. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but I gave both of these cards their best shot, and I did exceed the factory power limit of the XC3 via a BIOS mod. So that's no longer a concern for that card. The one reason why I did test this against the 3080 is just because, well, the 6900 XT is priced closer to the 3080 than the 3090, but also simply because I haven't been able to get my hands on a 3090. I would certainly love to test this card against that, but for today's video, the 3080 is what I have to work with. So that brings me to the point of how I was able to obtain these cards. They've been super hard to find, either the 3080 or the 6900 XT. I think the AMD cards have certainly been a lot harder to find. So I was actually able to order the 3080 off of Amazon pretty close to launch, a couple days after. And then I got super lucky and found somebody in my area who was willing to trade a 6900 XT for 3080 at a cost. So I'm told this person sat outside a Micro Center and then basically decided they wanted the extra money to upgrade other components in their system. So I was able to get this at MSRP, which I'm super excited about, but that unfortunately means I don't have the 3080 on hand for today's video, so everything related to the 3080 was recorded and benchmarked prior to receiving this card. Now, initial impressions, this is the first reference cooler from AMD that has actually came across this quality to me. It's an all metal design. It runs very cool. It actually is quieter than the XC3 Ultra, and it just feels like a way more premium product. But I think in the case of both AMD and NVIDIA, they're not really making a ton of money off of these reference or Founders Edition cards, so it's kind of hard for the AIBs to compete with this quality at this price. The one thing I would change about this is I would have blacked out the front and then preferred a darker color silver. I think it would match the aesthetics of my build a little bit better. But from what I've seen, the Radeon logo on these 6900s is actually RGB. So if you were to connect this LED to a header on a motherboard, then you could change the color manually. And I've saw some rumors that there's going to be some AMD software coming out in the near future, similar to the Wraith Prism app, that will allow you to change the color of this. Now, the XC3, on the other hand, is known to have the clown lips, which a lot of people, myself included, don't really seem to like. So I came up with a pretty simple solution to that. On Thingiverse, I have a file that you can download, and it's just an end cap that covers up the clown lips on the end, and then the red accents on the back can easily be covered up with permanent marker, and then if it ever has to be removed, rubbing alcohol works really well. I would like to point out that NVIDIA does have the FE version of the 3080, which I think is probably a higher quality design than the XC3, and would be much more comparable to this, and honestly probably even a little bit better in terms of just overall quality. But again, I think triple fan design, these cards are very comparable, both 2 slots, this one about 2.5 actually. It's certainly very heavy, much heavier than the XC3 3080. So going over the full system specs, I am running a AMD Ryzen 5900X with PBO enabled, and it's cooled via a semi-custom Thermaltake C360 cooling kit, and on an Asus Crosshair 8 Hero Wi-Fi motherboard. This was tested using the latest EVGA version and an EVGA 1000 watt PSU with 48 gigabytes of 3200 megahertz DDR4. Moving on to the overclocks I was able to achieve with these, I used the More Power tool for AMD to squeeze a little bit more power out of this Radeon card, raising the power limit to 300 watts with the sliders set to max, which is 15% over stock. So it's roughly set to 330 watts with the More Power tool. And this testing was also done with SAM enabled, because I feel like anybody who's running a Ryzen 5000 series should just have this enabled by default. We will see something similar to SAM on NVIDIA's side, most likely in the very near future, because after all, SAM is just a resizable bar with a fancy marketing name. So with that being said, I was able to achieve a stable overclock of 2.77 gigahertz on the core and 2150 on the memory, according to Wattman, which honestly blew away my expectations. This was on air, no sort of chilled cooling or anything like that. That was just in my case, side panel on and everything. That's what I was able to achieve. Now, looking at the actual clock frequencies that I was getting in game, it was closer to about 2.7 gigahertz than that 2.77 number, but it was rock solid. So one thing I did notice is just using the power play table mod generated better performance on this card out of the box without tweaking any of the core settings manually. So if you're looking to get a little bit better performance out of your 6900 XT, definitely do the More Power mod, which it's very easy to do and undo, and you just have to be kind of careful with your currents and whatnot. So moving on to the RTX 3080. So the EVGA card is limited to 366 watts out of the box, which is lower than the Founders Edition, which I believe is 375 watts. Now, to overcome that, I actually did flash my card with the FTW BIOS, and it worked extremely well. And Afterburner reported that I was running much higher power draw, about 380 watts stock, and then if I move the slider, it would go all the way up to 450 watts, but I wouldn't recommend that. It's only a dual 8-pin card, and which is probably fine, honestly, but just out of safety of the card and the VRM design of that, which is less than the FTW, it's probably not a good idea. I wouldn't run it full time at that power draw. I just wanted to see if it improved performance at all, and I can tell you it did not. Honestly, flashing the BIOS didn't make any significant difference in the performance of that card whatsoever. So the testing ended up being ran on the stock BIOS. After, I have a couple 3D Mark results, and after seeing no change or less than 1% difference within margin of error, essentially, I decided to run everything with the stock BIOS, and that gave me a final overclock of 2055 megahertz on the core and 1275 megahertz on the memory, and that's being reported by 3D Mark. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the benchmarks. So at 4K, you can see that the RX 6900 XT is barely faster stock for stock, about 3% accounting for ray tracing. I tried to split these games up pretty evenly, given that I only tested 5, and these are games that I've either played recently or actually have played in the past, so they weren't chosen completely randomly, but these are games that I actually play, so performance that actually matters. 2 of these do include ray tracing, coincidentally, which is a good point of comparison. And at 4K, the Radeon card was about 3% faster than the 3080, and that's including the ray tracing results. If we remove the ray tracing results from the list, it jumps to about 7%, which for the price increase isn't very great. Now, overclocking these cards is where things change. And I think looking at overclocking performance is very important because it can drastically change how a card performs. And personally, I run all of my cards overclocked in my system. just because I don't want to leave any potential performance on the table. And I think one previous scenario where this actually mattered a lot was like if you look at the Fury X versus the 980 Ti, where on paper, stock versus stock, the Fury X performed very closely to the 980 Ti, at least at launch. And even though AMD called it an overclocker's dream, it was actually quite the opposite, especially relative to the 980 Ti, which just overclocked phenomenally, and you could actually do a BIOS mod on that, which brought it very close to GTX 1080 performance and just absolutely creamed the Fury X. And I did own both cards, and I can say that for a fact. 980 Ti was one of my favorite cards to overclock and play around with at the time. So this time around, things are a little bit different. So the 6900 XT here managed to best the 3080 by 12% with RT enabled across these 5 games, which is pretty good, even given the price increase. I would really love to see how this would compare to a 3090. I think that would be a much more interesting battle, but it's good to see here that if you're spending more, you are getting more performance. And moving on to 1440p, this is where the Radeon card really showed the best results. Now, we are also getting some CPU bottlenecks here that I wanted to point out. Those are most evident in Dirt and Far Cry 5. Now, it does seem like when driver overhead is becoming an issue that the NVIDIA card actually pulls ahead. So if you're CPU limited, the 3080 does seem like it will give a little bit better performance. But yeah, here we see the Radeon coming in pretty significantly faster, with the biggest gains being in Forza and Tomb Raider. So we're looking at a 27% increase in performance versus the 3080 in Tomb Raider, which is just absolutely, phenomenal. Like, you're looking at almost 30% more performance, which is almost in line with the cost. And if you can get that kind of performance bump, suddenly this card doesn't look like such a bad value anymore. And then Shadow of the Tomb Raider showed very similar performance to Forza, where it bested the 3080 by 24% at 1440p. Now those are phenomenal gains, and one thing that I wanted to point out that I actually found interesting here is that in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, with ray tracing on, the Radeon card was actually able to overtake the 3080 with both of them overclocked. So that's quite the feat. There's no doubt about it that NVIDIA's ray tracing technology is superior to AMD's. So it's really good to see it putting up such good of a fight here. And now I will make a note here that it really depends on what type of ray tracing is being used, because in Watch Dogs, we can clearly see that the 3080 is about 18% faster with ray tracing on. If you turn ray tracing off, the tables flip, and the Radeon card's about 15% faster than the 3080. So it's definitely something to consider there. If ray tracing is really important to you, you might want to consider an NVIDIA card, but I'm going to talk about that more a little bit later on. Finally wrapping up, we had the 1080p results, and I really debated if I should include these or not. Here we're running into a major CPU bottleneck on both of these cards. Really, if you're running at 1080p, you probably don't need to spring for this level of performance. You could get a lower end card, and honestly, you would get the same frames because we're so CPU bound here. But I've included them nonetheless, and here these cards perform very similarly. Again, in games where we're CPU limited, the 3080 seems to have the advantage here, especially in Far Cry, where the 3080 is pulling ahead by almost 10%. Now then, I did test the 3080 with my CPU overclocked to 4.7 gigahertz all-core and observed about a 5% increase in performance. So if you're gaming at this low of a resolution, you might actually see more performance uplift from upgrading your CPU rather than splurging for one of these crazy high-end cards. So that's just something I want to make a note of. Really, 1080p is just... these cards are overkill for that. The one game that wasn't CPU bottlenecked though at 1080p was Forza, which saw this Radeon card just absolutely destroy the 3080 at 36% increase over it. Now, I do want to point out that this game is somewhat of an outlier. It performs extremely well on AMD cards, but that type of performance uplift is just absolutely insane. I did not expect to see any sort of results like that, but it's cool to see nonetheless. And then kind of going on to the downfall of AMD here, I could not get Dirt to run at 1080p on this card, no matter how hard I tried. It just crashed every single time. And I did try several times for at least an hour trying to get this to run, and I eventually gave up. And it did run flawlessly on the NVIDIA card, so that's one pretty big knock against this. And I'm going to be talking about some of the issues I've had with both of these cards a little bit later on as well. So moving on to software, I feel like in 2020 you cannot talk about these cards without talking about the software. NVIDIA has the clear software advantage here, whether it's DLSS, ray tracing, their full software suite with broadcast and whatever have you. There's a chance, even if you don't care about 90% of it, there's a chance there's something in there that really appeals to you. Me personally, I really did care about RTX, and I don't think I've owned an AMD card for my personal system, since RTX came out. I've owned several cards from both AMD and NVIDIA over the years. I've owned pretty much all of the 20 series cards, minus their super variants, and I thought they were excellent. And just having that ray tracing capability, it really felt like a step back going from NVIDIA to AMD in that case when AMD didn't support ray tracing at all. I truly do think ray tracing is the future, but it's amazing to see AMD finally offering hardware accelerated ray tracing. And I do want to point out during the time that I was rocking these RTX cards that I did try several AMD cards, including Crossfire, VEGA 64s, the Radeon 7, which I was very disappointed in that card. I found that it performed closely to a overclocked RTX 2060 Strix. And then I'm sure you might have noticed I included some 2080 Ti results in here. I didn't want to dwell on them too much just because I tested this on a 3900X, but I was kind of disappointed when I got the 3080, just because overclock versus overclock, we already had this performance. It just came at a much higher price, in my opinion. The 3080 wasn't really an upgrade for me. It was just, hey, I got this card cheaper than I sold my 2080 Ti for, so it kind of worked out, and it's great in that sense that it's finally bringing this level of performance down in price so more people can access it. But I think it is a little bit overhyped in that sense. Now, talking about DLSS, personally, DLSS is somewhat of a mixed bag for me. I haven't been impressed by it in the games that I have used it on. It certainly does improve performance, which is awesome, and I would much rather enable DLSS than have to turn down my resolution because I'm unable to get the frame rate that I want at 4K, which is what I primarily game at. And from that standpoint, I think it's great. Great for improving performance while offering the best image quality possible. What I haven't seen so far, though, is that, there's certainly a lot of claims and some truth to it, too, that DLSS can improve image quality. In some scenarios, it certainly does. But in my general, overall just observation, I found in the games that I've used it on, DLSS 2.0, mind you, DLSS 1.0 is generally accepted not to have been very good. But I just find that it looks blurrier than running at native. So if I have the option to run at native with an acceptable frame rate, I would always do that. And it's certainly nice to have that option for games like Watch Dogs Legion that simply do not run at 4K native resolution on these types of cards. I kind of miss the days of multi-GPU setups. That's what I started out with. I loved it, but it seems like those aren't coming back anytime soon. Now, I do wish AMD had some type of solution or, counter product to this. They're said to be working on one, but it's not available yet. So if you're on an AMD card and you need to improve performance, you're unfortunately going to have to lower resolution, and I would recommend enabling Radeon image sharpening, which is supposed to improve the detail and whatnot, improve the overall image quality at the resolution that you're running at. So is it as good as DLSS? No. It's not, but it is a solution, and that's probably what I'm going to be doing when I'm using this card, depending on the game. Talking about ray tracing performance, I think this card performs somewhat similarly to the 2080 Ti in terms of ray tracing, which is fine. So far I haven't found a game that I could play with the ray tracing on an NVIDIA card that I couldn't play on this one. Granted, most of the time the NVIDIA cards had to use DLSS, so I wasn't running at native there. Anyways, this card, I have to lower the resolution, so it's a trade-off, but the overall experience, honestly, very similar. I'm not running at native. I personally, as I mentioned, find it looks a little bit blurrier. The NVIDIA card obviously would have a little bit better image quality because of that DLSS. Yeah, in general, I would find that lowering this card to 1800p or 1440p produced a very similar, experience. And I did go back through and play all of the games that I've previously, tried with RTX on, or ray tracing, I should say, for that matter. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, very playable at 4K with ray tracing on with this card. Call of Duty Modern Warfare, I played that and was getting well over 100 frames with ray tracing on, so no issue there. It's great to be able to play that game with ray tracing on. Certainly slower than the RTX 3080, I will say that. It was slower than 3080. And the type of ray tracing being used definitely depends on how much it impacts the performance on this card. I did try Minecraft RTX on this, and I will say it ran fine. Like, you'll notice in a lot of reviews, it performs very badly on AMD, but in order for it to perform well on an NVIDIA card, I had to enable DLSS. I unfortunately never played that on my 3080, so I don't know how it performed on that card, and that was mainly because I couldn't get it to run. Every time I opened Minecraft, it wouldn't allow me to enable ray tracing. I don't know if that's just because it hadn't been updated up to that point, but I did try it out on my 2080 Ti, and it was unplayable without DLSS. Similarly, this card here, unplayable at 4K unless you enjoy watching a slideshow. But dropping it down to 1440p, very playable, and honestly, in a game like Minecraft, I don't really think that the resolution makes that big of a difference. So yeah, that was playable still, and then yeah, you guys saw the results for like Watch Dogs and all that. If you drop your resolution down, you can still enjoy all of the ray tracing glory, and there will certainly be exceptions to this. For example, Cyberpunk currently does not run on AMD hardware with ray tracing enabled, which is really disappointing, and I hope that ray tracing exclusivity is something that doesn't happen in the future. We've seen AMD basically do it first with Godfall, and it's just something I don't want to see. I want everybody to be able to enable ray tracing. I think it's great, and it is truly a game changer in my opinion. And if a game has it, I will certainly be enabling it, even if it does mean I have to drop down my resolution a little bit. Moving on, other software elements to talk about. AMD has their Radeon Control Center, which honestly I think looks really good. Like, AMD did a good job with this. It's certainly a vast improvement over Catalyst Control Center, and I certainly think it looks better than NVIDIA's control panel. Granted, NVIDIA also has GeForce experience. It's nice to kind of have everything in one centralized location. Now, there are a lot of gimmicks within here. Honestly, AMD, at least in terms of naming, I'm sure some of these features are actually really great. I haven't had a chance to really dig through all of them. It's certainly been overhauled significantly since I last ran an AMD card in my system, with features like anti-lag, Radeon Chill as they call it. I'm not sure how many gamers are actually using these types of features, but I think they're worthy of mentioning nonetheless. And then granted, like I said earlier, on the NVIDIA side, they just have a much more complete software suite, whether it be RTX Voice, PhysX, even though it's not really used anymore, Ansel. There's just so many offerings on the NVIDIA side that just really aren't found on AMD. And it's definitely worth pointing those out if you're shopping for a new graphics card. Kind of discussing the VRAM of these two, I know there's a lot of people saying, oh, 10 gigabytes isn't enough for the RTX 3080. And my opinion on this is it's fine. Just fine. I'm not like, oh, it's plenty, but it's fine. I do think the 10 gigabytes will be a limiting factor in the future. There's already some games that will use that. For example, Watch Dogs Legion gives me a warning at the end of the benchmark actually saying that I have insufficient VRAM if I try running it at 4K with maximum settings. Granted, neither card could do 4K native with max settings, so it ended up being less of an issue than I initially thought. I think the bigger problem here is that the 3080 is being touted as a replacement for the 2080 Ti, and the 2080 Ti had more VRAM. I think that's the bigger issue here, is that in some ways the 3080 just felt like a downgrade from the previous generation card, right? But 10 gigabytes I think is fine. Will it be limiting in the future? I do think so. It's not like the 3070, which I think the 3070 is actually not enough with only 8 gigs of VRAM. I've ran several cards in the past that have had VRAM issues, one notably the Fury X. I don't think I need to say anything more. When that card launched, everyone kind of knew that 4 gigabytes was not enough. Even their next card down, the 3090, had 8 gigs. So that kind of speaks to, even AMD's thoughts on the matter. Moving on from that, the 980 Ti, 6 gigs of VRAM, 50% more than the Fury X. With that massive overclock I talked about earlier, it came very close to the 1080. But some games, like Rise of the Tomb Raider, required more than that. So even though the card had physically enough power to run the game at the settings I wanted, it was getting terrible stutters and basically being unplayable because it didn't have enough VRAM. And I found that swapping that card out for a 1070, even though the 1070 was slower in most games that I would run, I was able to run higher settings in Rise of the Tomb Raider simply because it had that VRAM and it was no longer an issue. And then most recently the non-Super 2060. That's actually the reason I got rid of the card. VRAM was limiting. It's not a 4K card, but I did play some games at 4K on that. And yeah, the 6 gigs of VRAM was my main complaint about that card. I really liked it. It simply wasn't enough. So for that reason, I would actually kind of be hesitant to buy a 3070 for sure. 10 gigs on the 3080, honestly, it's okay. Yeah, you might have to lower some settings in the future or on some games. The 16 gigs on the Radeon card is very nice. I'm so glad they did that. But it's not a make or break for me. It's just a little disappointing that the 3080 only has 10 gigs. So moving on now, both of these cards certainly have had some issues. One much more than the other. So let me jump into that. I will say I've owned several AMD cards on launch, the RX 480, the Vega Frontier Edition, and this one, surprisingly, has been mostly, plug and play and has just worked. And you're going to go, wait, what, really? After I explain the issues that I've had? Because, like I said, there have certainly been some issues. And the AMD card has had more. Like, I'm gonna be honest here. Like, NVIDIA's software support has been top notch. I've only really had one issue with the 3080, and that is just sometimes it doesn't output video. Like even when I start up Windows, I know I'll have to go unplug and plug back in the card. And Ubisoft software also seems to have an issue where if I try to alt tab out of the game, it just won't display anything with Uconnect open. So I have to have something else open in the background. Otherwise, I get no display. Whether or not that's a Ubisoft issue or an NVIDIA driver issue, I don't know. But that's like the only real issue I had on the 3080. Annoying, but at the end of the day, not a big deal. The AMD card, on the other hand, could be better. So some issues I've had, just to name a few, that alt tabbing issue is not an issue on this card. But what is an issue, I know, is if I'm running a game, again, specifically Ubisoft titles for some reason, and I change the resolution, it just crashes. Doesn't happen all the time. I don't know why. It just crashes, though. And then as you saw in Dirt Rally, I wasn't able to run that game at 1080p. Once again, just crashes. I no explanation for this. That really is the biggest software issue I've been having with this card. And then another one, it seems to be related to my display. Probably some kind of HDMI handshake issue or something. It's only present on Radeon cards, and I've had this issue probably ever since the Radeon 7. I had it with the 5700. And that's just if I launch a game full screen and I don't manually set the refresh rate, if it's set to auto, sometimes I just get this staticky image. Sometimes it causes my TV to reset. So there's some sort of issue there. I ended up having to switch it to window mode to get it to run properly. And then, sometimes I can switch it to full screen and it's fine. So definitely a driver issue there. It seems to be isolated to my TV. If I connect it to other monitors or other TVs, it seems to not be an issue. So I'm not quite sure what's happening there, but it's very annoying. And I think that's really the only software issue I've had with this car, or those two, I should say. Definitely major, definitely more than the NVIDIA card. Not quite as, smooth and seamless of an experience, but there's more issues than just that, and that is coil line. It's pretty bad on this card. Every high-end AMD card I've had since the R9 Fury has had pretty bad coil line, and I wish they would work on this. My 3080 had an ever so slight amount, but I would consider that to be normal. It didn't bother me at all. This, if I don't have headphones on, it's kind of like, really? Why? It's pretty loud. Here's just a little clip of it. So yeah, I wish they would work on that. Those are the main issues that I've had with these cards. And then kind of going on to like miscellaneous use cases outside of gaming, both of these worked really well for modeling, whether it be SolidWorks or NX. Yeah, no issue with either of these. These are very powerful cards. I'm going to say this user experience was comparable, at least for what I did. Whether you want to, design an end plate for a card to cover up ugly clown lips, or you want to make a 3D model of yourself. Yeah, either way, both of these cards handled that just fine. One thing I do want to say is, in general, NVIDIA does have better support in random applications, and that's just a fact based on what I've seen. So something else that I've tested here are two emulators. I've tested the Xenia Xbox 360 emulator, and while I was able to actually play some games on that on the RTX 3080 just fine, it's completely unusable on the Radeon card. When using the DirectX 12 backend, it simply gives me a black screen. I got a couple games to launch once, and they showed the intro titles, but anytime I did any sort of real rendering, I just got a black screen, which was really unfortunate. Switching over to the Vulkan backend, kind of made it run a little bit on the AMD cards, but that's no longer supported by the developers of that. And then again, I got black screens. So 3080 major win there. I was able to play Xbox 360 games via emulation. I still have quite a few of those laying around. So yeah, that's kind of disappointing, but it's honestly not something I do that often. And this is something I remember from the past. I'd actually forgotten about that until I got this AMD card, is that, yeah, there's some software that simply doesn't work well with AMD, and they tend to be supported less in general. They have a much lower, market share percentage after all. And I did test RCPS3, another emulator, PlayStation 3 emulator. I used to love playing the show games on the PlayStation, and I still have some of them. I really haven't been able to find a good baseball game that's not on PlayStation. So I fired up the show, and it actually worked. On this card. Very similar performance on the 3080 and 6900, so that wasn't an issue there, but just once again, there tends to be better support on the NVIDIA side. So if you use software that's not as common or as popular, you might want to just double check that it actually will work on the card of your choosing. So just to wrap this up, which one would I actually buy, or which one would I recommend? Honestly, I think that depends. You have to ask yourself, what do you care about most? At $1,000, I think this is certainly faster than the RTX 3080, assuming you only care about rasterization performance. Now, if you really want those NVIDIA technologies like ray tracing, like absolute best ray tracing performance, or DLSS, then obviously the choice is clear. You're going to have to go to the GeForce cards. And really that's what it's going to come down to, well, outside of availability, but let's assume that you can actually buy any of these cards right now. I think the 3080, for example, is the clear choice over the 6800 XT, given only the $50 price difference there. But if you're okay with overclocking and you're looking for something that performs a little bit better than the 3080, but don't really want to spend 3090 money, being $1,500 or $1,800, I really feel like this card fills a nice gap, and it's kind of just what I was looking for in the product stack. With that being said, I do think there's going to be a 3080 Ti soon that performs very similarly to the 3090, and I would love to get my hands on either one of those cards, because if it performs similarly at the $1,000 price range, then that really does make this card here pretty irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. And yeah, given this video, it was a very limited sampling size of games. I really would like to test more when I can get my hands on another GeForce card. But given the scarcity of these cards, I really don't want to have one sitting on the shelf or something like that. I'm going to wait for availability to get a little bit better before I try to benchmark any sort of other card. I know, even though I'm sure I have tons of friends who would love or buy the card off of me, but I'll just wait. Yeah, either card is honestly a really good option in my opinion. These 6900s, I would love to see AIB models start to come out with higher power limits so you don't have to do the more power mod. This would be a phenomenal card to put under a water block in my opinion, or maybe the ASUS Strix liquid cooled model. I'm not sure if other vendors are planning liquid cooled variants, but given the overclocking potential of these, I think those are all really good options. On the 3080 side, it's a lot cheaper and performs honestly pretty closely to this in most scenarios. Better in ray tracing. Like I said, I would probably buy it over a 6800 XT. But I think that about wraps it up for this one, guys. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.